Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Charissa Fleischer, and I am a Senior Manager of Technical Writing at Palo Alto Networks. I am presenting with my colleague, Steve Sarette, who is a Principal Technical Writer at Palo Alto Networks. We are delighted to share our approach to automating data workflows using PubOps. So during our presentation, we will introduce you to PubOps and our PubOps team members. We will talk about the problem we are trying to solve with our PubOps strategy and the DevOps methodologies that we try to embody. We will share some of our PubOps goals and our first steps into solving the problem, which will include our PubOps architecture and environment. We will also share how we created a test harness and share some of our content automation projects. And finally, we will reflect on the lessons we learned along the way, share our vision for the evolution of PubOps, and then Steve will wrap things up with our final conclusion. So first off, what is PubOps? PubOps is short for PubOps, also known as Publications Operation. Applies the DevOps methodologies that we talk to later in this presentation and adapts them to our technical publications organization. We are a renegade band of API writers and scripting enthusiasts. No one on our team contributes to our objectives with a full-time capacity. Contribution is voluntary, and everyone contributes when they can. The makeup of our team varies in both background and experience. Debbie is a 20-year veteran in the software engineering industry, but is now an API writer for Palo Alto Networks. She is one of the newest members of the team who is not yet working with DITA, but is well-versed in open API spec files. Steve, as I mentioned, is our principal technical writer, and he's focused on developer docs and is our lead PubOps developer. Jonathan is a new API writer with less than 5 years experience, but has a great grasp of Python. And then there is me. While I don't have any formal API authoring experience, I've always been interested in scripting languages, and Steve has been gracious enough to teach me. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the solution that we came up with, I thought it would be helpful to share a bit about the challenges that our team was facing. In our regular authoring process, we were seeing lots of documentation get submitted in our CMS that contained errors that would either break our build or introduce quality issues. For example, links can go stale, formatting can be misapplied, and misspellings can occur. In addition, documentation written in XML is susceptible to element misuse. Element misuse can include elements that are not supported in DITA, but are supported in DITA but are not supported in our output, or using elements in a way that is not contextually valid. In some cases, element misuse could also be topics that are missing specific elements that are required for our use case. Many of these issues were silently submitted to our repository and not caught until it was time to publish. Because of the timing, these issues cause a lot of churn around releases and a lot of scrambling that really could have been addressed ahead of time. So when we began thinking about creating a solution to tackle our challenges, we realized that we were loosely following DevOps methodologies. If you aren't familiar with DevOps, DevOps is traditionally ingrained in software development teams to streamline the ability to deliver software. I came across this list by WWT Application Services. I thought that if we swapped out software for documentation, that was exactly what we were trying to achieve. So you can see in this list, I've done just that. So we for sure wanted to enhance the productivity of our writers and streamline our documentation delivery. As our company is trending in the direction of shorter release times, they also want us to increase the frequency at which we can release content. So we definitely want to be able to support increasing the deployment frequency. In terms of streamlining workflows, we wanted to find a way to automate not only individual topic creation, but full books when possible. We also wanted to reduce the number of errors that went uncaught, as well as the number of errors that caused a doc build to break. And lastly, we wanted to create a solution that would prevent errors when we ran production, as unchecked errors could cause rework for many teams, including the writers, our production and web staff, and even our support teams. So with DevOps principles in mind, we came up with the following high-level goals. Firstly, we wanted to create a test harness that would proactively report errors and run on a nightly basis. The errors would include issues that would break the build, such as missing images or topics, and quality issues that were specific to our style or DITA implementation, such as missing short descriptions or lengthy titles. The nightly reports would give writers an opportunity to identify and resolve issues before we went to publish. Next, we wanted to script the repetitive tasks to increase the productivity of our writers. This included tasks that we had to perform semi-regularly, such as to search and replace for product names when they change, and in our case, some have done so quite a few times, and to perform versioning activities for new releases. We also wanted to work on content creation projects where content could be pulled from secondary sources. Because we author in XML, our content is easily manipulated and created using scripts. Content creation includes partial topics, full topics, and even full books. These projects can typically replace time-consuming and monotonous writing projects where the writer is performing lots of copy and paste activities. As an added bonus, we wanted to help strengthen the skills of the writers focused on developer docs to give them a larger picture of development practices. Overall, these goals would streamline the writing process to free writers up to pursue more fulfilling or creative writing projects. So about 2 years ago, we put the wheels in motion and began to set up our test harness and execute our POP strategy. Now I'll turn it over to Steve, who really led the development effort here to talk about POPs, architecture, and our authoring environment.
Hi. So there's a lot going on in this slide, but before I get into it, I just want to point out that it's important if you are going to engage in any kind of an XML authoring environment, whether it's DITA or DocBook or something else, you really do need a test harness. The first time I ever did something like this was at a previous job. And literally, we just created some shell scripts that we ran as a cron job on somebody's server that was in their basement on the East Coast. So it doesn't have to be a big deal, but it is very important when you have team writing, multiple people contributing to the XML, or even a single person, to be testing your books to make sure that errors aren't being inserted into the source as time goes by. There's nothing different here than what an engineering team will typically do. Engineering frequently has, unit tests and similar repetitive tests that they can run automated to make sure that their code is in good shape, and you want to do the same thing with your docs. When I started on this at Palo Alto Networks, we didn't have a test harness, and my first release at Palo Alto Networks, I literally just created a shell script that I ran on my laptop every day manually to make sure that the docs that we were going to be pushing for a large release that was coming up were in good shape. But that is obviously time-consuming, and it's easy to lose track of it as other priorities pop up, so we wanted to automate this thing. So what we did is we used Python. Initially, Python was just being used to call DITA to build the PDF for each of the books in our doc set. DITA would, if there was an error, spit out some pretty complicated error messaging that was hard for the writers to understand. So then we went a step further and started looking for ways to make it easier to understand where the errors were in in the doc sets, in the individual documents. And I'll get into a little bit more about how that works. But in the process of doing all of this, we discovered that we had some steep security requirements we had to conform to, because Palo Alto Networks is a security company, and they weren't going to let us just run a script on a junk PC sitting in the corner of a cube somewhere. So what we ended up doing is we had to split our logic between an internal, really a black box environment that engineering controls, which is where the actual tests run, and an external virtual machine, which is where we present the test results, which is what this slide is showing. In order for us to do that, we had to create a Docker image, which is just essentially just a Unix environment that calls the Python script that we wrote in order to run the tests. The Docker, when it starts up, pulls from Perforce, gets the latest content that is checked into Perforce. The script is run, performing an ever-increasing large number of tests. At this time, the tests are taking about 2 hours to run every night. At the point where the tests get done, we have a large tarball that contains the test results. Those are pushed to the staging server that you see in the slide here. And then from the staging server, on PubOps, which is a virtual machine, we have a cron job that wakes up and pulls test results down from the staging server. And then that cron job runs over the test results and creates a web page that represents the results of the nightly test run. It is, I guess, important to note that this is necessary regardless of what your target platforms are, whether you're trying to get to HTML or PDF, or whether you want to do some other interesting transformations of your data to other targets. We happen to publish almost exclusively on AEM. So what we're trying to do is optimize our production AEM workflows by catching problems early before they pop up. So the way that the script actually works, so what we have is an XML file that identifies every doc set, every release, and every book in every doc set that we manage. So the script starts up, reads that, discovers where all the books are in Perforce, and then it runs through a series of pre-checks. And the pre-checks are really, they're mostly intended to discover if the book has any kind of a critical error that would prevent it from building. So what we're doing is we're looking to make sure that every DITA map that's referenced in the book is in fact checked in, that every topic file that's in the book is checked in, and that every image file that the book uses is checked in. Our most common error is people forgetting to check in image files. That's just a function of, I think, how we have information organized in Perforce. Can you back up one? I'm not quite done. Yeah, there. So we run through those pre-checks, and if a book has one of these critical errors, we then really don't do much more with it. We just mark it as a failed book, and we don't do any further testing on it. And those pre-checks have to come up clean before we'll move on to the next step, which is a PDF build. So we do go ahead and build the PDF for every single book. This allows us to catch DTD validation errors and other things that we haven't written a pre-check for. So there's all kinds of creative ways to break an XML file, and I have not yet thought of a way to catch everything except for by just simply building the PDF and seeing how DITA complains. Once a book has gotten through the pre-check and the PDF build, we move on to our last step, and this is still experimental, but you can see it here in the extreme right hand side of the test results, the example test result page. we do quality checks. So we start walking the topic files looking for issues that don't prevent the book from being built and don't prevent the book from being published, but that we would really rather not be there. This is experimental. We don't have this fully in production right now. We're working on the scoring system so that we can arrive at a quality score for each doc set, for each version of each doc set, and each book in the doc set. But essentially the way it works is if we see a quality problem, for instance, a topic file might not have a short description, we will take a point or two off of the quality of that book with a floor. So we won't take more than, a book typically has maybe 100 topic files or a couple hundred topic files. If we start seeing a lot of topic files without short descriptions, we would only take maybe up to a maximum of 5 points off. But that gives the doc managers the ability to very quickly look and see that the quality of their books is suffering from some problem. And I don't think we have a slide that shows it, but then you can drill down into the quality scores and see exactly what it is, what the complaint is about any given book, and all the way down to which topic file has the actual problem. But as I said, we're still working on that, and we're still experimenting with the quality, the whole quality score. So, as I said, there's a lot going on here, and this is actually fairly complicated. This is not the way I would have built it if I'd been at a company that didn't have the security requirements that we had to write to. You could certainly do this using something like Jenkins and roll it into a CI/CD documentation process. This may eventually grow into that kind of thing. I can see how this would feed into a CI/CD eventually, but we're going to have to work our way forward to see how we can make that work and still sort of adhere to the security requirements that we have from our company. Charissa, next slide. Okay, so this is just an example of a doc build problem. This was a pre-check failure. The reason why we want to show this is one of the big goals here is to very efficiently be able to tell a writer that they have a problem. It may not be a big problem, but still it's a problem that needs to be resolved. So every book ends up that has an error, some kind of an error, and it ends up with a page like this. The pages are date stamped, and the page will contain every single failure that we see in the book. In this particular case, there's a missing image file. Almost certainly this is just the writer forgot to check in that image file. In some rare cases, what happens is the image file gets checked in, but they forgot to check in the topic file that has been updated to use the image file. But just by having a page like this, all I have to do is copy that link, put it into Slack and send it to the writer, and they know that there's something they need to take care of. We don't right now have automated reporting. That's down the road on our roadmap. Again, this is a function of some of the security issues that we have to deal with at Palo Alto Networks. It'd be easy enough in a different environment to set up a email server or something and just automate the email, but we aren't right now able to do that. But this page would, in a more complicated case, would have a lot of bullets that are indicating a bunch of different XML topic files that have a problem and a bunch of different problems with any given topic file. Next slide. All right, well, I already talked a little bit about how we did this. So a big part of what we were doing when we wrote the test harness this way was I was using it as a vehicle. Initially, it was just Charissa, to help Charissa have an opportunity to learn Python. She wanted to learn it. So I was giving her functions and classes to write that then fed into ultimately the creation of the test harness. But certainly anybody on our team who wants to participate in PubsOps needs to learn Python. That's the language that we're using to implement our tools. I'd like to say that number 2 was a nice clean step where we, sat down and sort of scratched all this out and knew exactly what we were trying to achieve. But in fact, I started off with very simple expectations, and the thing has been growing with complexity as time goes by. So the more that we do, the more that people want to see us do. But we did manage to design the thing so it does scale. And again, if you were using something like Jenkins, something that has a CI/CD plugin capability, it might be a little bit easier to get to this point. But as I said, we were starting off with one thing in mind, and this thing has morphed into something else that we then had to modify to make IT happy. And that was step 3. That conversation with IT was a surprise when we found out we had to start creating Docker images and things like that. So we did, and then step 4 was we did break everything up into modular components. Actually, when we started writing it, I was being very careful to make sure to separate things out into isolated sections of code so it would be easy to change one part without interfering with the other. But that's just good software development practices, and I think we've done a pretty good job with that. Integrating with the source code, the source system, we haven't gotten as far with that as I want. My initial idea was we would monitor perforce check-ins and then only exercise those books that were being modified within the last 24 hours. But because we're operating inside of the Eng Tools sort of secured lab, and they're the ones who actually pull do all the Python work, I don't right now have visibility into that messaging. In a simpler environment with fewer requirements, it'd be a lot easier to do this integration. But at some point down the road, we're going to have to cross that Rubicon because it's just really inefficient to exercise the entire doc set every night. We're going to eventually reach a point where we just can't do the whole thing in, say, 3-4 hours. The scoring system, there's been a lot of conversation around that. And the scoring system really is only something that you need if you're going to get into quality checks. We'll talk a little bit more down in this presentation about what we're going with the quality checks and some of the things we're looking for. But essentially, the quality checks are automating some of the things that a good editor would catch. With the idea being that our editors then can go away and focus on more interesting and worthwhile things while we catch the more routine kinds of problems. And then, well, we begin developing checks here at the end, but actually we were developing the checks even as we were figuring out the scoring system and everything else. It was all sort of a proof of concept as we kind of rolled through this.
You move on, Steve. A question on the chat. Can
Sure.
you go over what the Docker function is in our work?
So if you don't know what Docker is it's a kind of virtual machine. It's a very lightweight virtual machine. And it's a way of having a very isolated and portable, well, it can be any operating system, but in our case, it's a Unix environment. So you could install Windows in it, but we happen to be using Linux. And basically it is a virtual machine. So you could fire up your Docker image and then at your keyboard interact with it as if it was a Linux computer. But the way we have configured it to work in the engineering tools environment, what happens is they call the Docker image. It is launched as a process And then when it is launched, what it does is it calls our test harness. So our test harness is just a single command line call. It's a Python script. And so the image starts up, it mounts all the external file systems that it needs to operate. The image then runs the script, which, as I said, takes a couple hours. As the script runs, it's writing test results down to the mounted external file system so that then when the script gets done, the Docker image shuts down, so it's not running persistently. And then processes and tools that we don't have any control over pick up our test results file and put it off into the staging server so that we can retrieve it. Does that answer the question?
I see no follow-up, so I think so.
Okay.
The next slide.
Yeah, next slide. Okay, so the test harness is just one thing that we're doing, and it's really worth doing. And I really feel like if you're going to, as an organization, do anything, do a test harness. And even if you don't want to have your writing team creating the test harness, you need to have someone create a test harness or find a test harness or do something. But as it turns out, because of the way we wrote the test harness and because of the experience we were gaining just in doing that, it naturally led us to the ability to automate content creation. And these are a few of the examples of books that we create by script. So these are books that don't really require a writer to open FrameMaker. Almost all of our writers use FrameMaker for their authoring. But if you're not using FrameMaker for your authoring, it turns out at Palo Alto Networks, you're using Python for your authoring. So what we do in lieu of having somebody manually sitting in FrameMaker typing words, we create a script that reads generally internal engineering information sources, and these can be either JSON files, XML files, sometimes spreadsheets, whatever it is that we can get at, and we use it to create almost exclusively their reference guides. So these are the kinds of books that are just these really long, lengthy tables and reference topics, highly repetitive, but it's content that's changing continually throughout the engineering development process. And if we didn't do it this way, we would have to hire people to sit there and manually look at these sources and start copying and pasting from the sources into FrameMaker, which is really not a happy job. So instead, we just use Python to do this sort of stuff. So the first one is explore schema reference. The schema here is the schema is if you're familiar with databases, every database has a schema. It identifies the tables and the fields that you can use for a query. That's essentially what this is, although it's not a SQL database. But we're identifying all the log types and all the fields on every log type that you can query for in Cortex Data Lake. The next one is the Panos release notes. This was a very complicated script to write because the processes that the team was using to maintain and develop the release notes was very complicated. So I actually spent many weeks interviewing the writers on the team to understand exactly what it was they were doing before I sat down and started writing actually a suite of scripts that we used to make it a lot easier to stay on top of the release notes. But essentially, these things are just reading from Jira. So all of our release note information is contained in Jira tickets. So this script reads Jira, and it builds reports in HTML so that the writer can see where there's work to be done. And then at publishing time, the scripts can actually create the DITA topics that are used that we publish as release notes. So all the known issues and all the addressed issues are being written down to disk with this. We want to evolve this script eventually to take over the generation of the entire release notes manual, but at the moment, it's just taking control of a few specific sections of the book, the ones that are most repetitive to be used, to be developed. Traps management, that the next two are actually Charissa's. You want to talk about those?
Sure. Yeah, the Traps Management Service Administrator's Guide. This was probably one of my first scripting projects after Steve started teaching me Python. So this was just a few topics in the guide itself where customers would have log messages and would need to know the severity and a couple other things like the category. So we had some CSV files that Dev would send us as containing all of the information, and we would transform it into those topics. And then the next one is the Cortex XDR Analytics Alert Reference. This is a more recent project. And we've been working with Dev very closely on actually defining the input files that we want to see. So defining the specific fields in the JSON. So we've actually had more input here than I think I have, at least in other projects. And then as needed, we can edit those JSON files. If there's text in there that they write that's not quite right, we can author there and then import it using our scripts and create the book in its entirety.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's one piece of this that we didn't really talk about because it doesn't really write DITA, but it sort of illustrates where we're going with these scripts. But we do have a project where we're authoring content that shows up directly in a user interface. So it's not in online help, it's literally right in the user interface as you're using the product. So we're authoring that content, and what we're doing is we're authoring the content in an engineering resource, and we're actually authoring it in XHTML fragments. But we have a script that reads that and then assembles it into a JSON file that we check in and then is loaded into the database. But what's interesting about that is as we run that script, we're actually performing spell checks and link checks and other kinds of quality checks to make sure that what we're sending off to the database for presentation in the UI is as good as we can make it be. I expect that down the road we will take that logic that we built, those classes that we built to do that, and we'll roll it into some of the scripts that we've talked about here.
Great. So in preparing for this presentation, we had the opportunity to reflect on what we learned from our experience getting PubsOps off the ground and came up with these takeaways. So first, before you get started, reach out to IT to discuss any data or security concerns and make sure you understand the requirements. Early on, we had our ideas on how and where we wanted the test harness to store data and send out notifications, but had to switch gears when IT ultimately wouldn't allow access in the way we had envisioned. So knowing this beforehand can ensure you don't plan around and code to a solution that ultimately won't work. Since our team didn't have any full-time developers, we used the resources we had, which in this case were mainly our API writing team, Steve and myself. So out of everyone on the team, my skills were probably the weakest, so I had to start learning. I recommend that if you do have anyone currently fluent in a scripting language such as Python, that you set up a study group and pick a Python basics book to work through. As you begin picking up your coding skills, think about the repetitive tasks that you currently perform and how you might automate those with scripts.
Yeah, can I interrupt just a second, Charissa? Regarding the scripting language that you use, we ended up using Python because I've had over 20 years of experience with it more than anything else. But as it also turns out that Python is very heavily used within Palo Alto Networks, so it was a good fit for the company. If you were going to, in your company, go off and do something like this, you might want to talk to your engineering and QA teams to find out what they're using for scripting language. And if it turns out they're using something else, be it Ruby or Node.js or something like that, I would suggest just trying to stay within the culture of your company so that if you need help, you can find people to help you.
Yes, good point. So next, our takeaway would be to be patient. For us, that meant continually reminding ourselves that everyone on the team has other commitments and to set timeline expectations accordingly. Now, in terms of documentation, for a documentation team, ours was somewhat minimal. I think it is very important to document your process and even have a script reference page available, especially as you add new team members. As in most of our objectives, efficiency is key, and you don't want to have to individually onboard everyone who wants to participate. Another takeaway would be to define what your testing environment should look like and make sure that everyone on the team works with the same environment. So for example, as Steve mentioned, we all use Python 3, and our Windows users will use Ubuntu subsystems, and we all use the same environment variables. We also try to avoid using Python libraries that require people using the scripts to download and import those additional libraries. And lastly, share your accomplishments. We think of our team's role as dedicated to helping ourselves and others automate repetitive processes in the name of efficiency and scalability. Oftentimes, sharing our accomplishments would spark an interest in others who either want to contribute or to have an idea on something we can automate. So we want to make sure to support those that have an interest in what we are doing. So what's next? Here are some things that we've been actively investigating as part of our PubOps roadmap. First, we want to add more contributors. We want anyone who has an interest in scripting or developer docs to be able to participate. We definitely have more than enough work to go around, so the more people we can get interested, the better. We also want to leverage the Google APIs to integrate G Suite apps, such as Google Sheets, as inputs. This would enable us to manage content outside of the Unix environment. For example, our editor could maintain a corporate word list in Google Sheets that would feed into our test harness and be used in a quality check. Which leads me to our next goal, to add more quality and validation tests. As I mentioned, we wanted to add a word list check that would include specific words and phrases used by our company. We also want to add additional quality checks for spelling and trademark and registration use. We also want to make sure all internal and external links are valid. We've already made some progress on the internal linking and rogue topic reporting. In addition, we want to add some topic completeness checks, which include identifying topics that don't have short descriptions, titles that exceed our length guidelines, and images that scale beyond our fixed page width. And finally, we want to identify white space issues, which can sometimes be tricky to spot in FrameMaker, such as when there's a space before a closing punctuation. Now, we've also talked about leveraging the AEM APIs to automate uploads to a staged server. On a nightly basis, when content successfully passes all build checks, we'd like for the test harness to trigger a content upload to AEM. Then we'd like AEM to run production and activate the content so that it is ready for review as soon as an author needs it in the morning. Right now, we have a landing page that displays the nightly status of books in all doc sets. Currently, it is set up. Currently, it is up to us and the writers to check the status of their books. We would like to supplement the status page with the ability to notify the book owner if the book fails to build. And lastly, we would like to explore more data visualization to display production and quality trends over time. So I'll turn it back to Steve to wrap up our presentation by sharing our overall conclusion.
So I think I'm just repeating myself here, but again, what we did was very specific to our company. And what you would do if you wanted to do something like this would be very specific to your company. A small company, a startup, with only one or two writers can get away with some kind of an informal, not particularly complicated test harness just to help them recognize that they're on track. I've certainly done that plenty of times in other companies with other doc sets. But as the size of your company grows and as the number of products that you're supporting grows, that really increases the need to create a much more robust test harness, and which then I think will eventually lead you to some kind of a CI/CD pipeline. One of the things that we did here, so we didn't have any on-staff full-time scripting resources in our TechPubs organization when we started. We could certainly have pushed for that, but I'm a firm believer that the best developer documentation writers are the writers who have actually spent time writing code. They're people who have had to go away and consume DevDoc for projects that they have been trying to accomplish. And so that causes them to end up with strong opinions about what developer documentation should look like, and to have a better understanding of how developer documentation should be put together in order to best serve that particular audience. So I pushed for at the time, and I still firmly believe that we need for our development documentation writers to be involved in this effort. But of course, it's all voluntary. Not everybody has the background. Not everybody has the time. But I think it's going to make for better developer documentation writers. That said, the opportunity is not limited to just our DevDoc writers. If a writer who is working on enterprise documentation wanted to contribute, we would certainly take them on board, because we're always willing to take advantage of any help we can get. If you do go down this path, what you'll find out is the opportunities for automation are endless. We've talked a little bit about some of the stuff that we're doing. The truth of the matter is that every single time I start talking to one of the other TechDocs managers and individual writers, people start popping up with all kinds of ideas and things that they want to know, can we do this to make their life a little bit easier? I think our wish list is, if I could stop writing and just write code for, full time forever, I could be writing stuff for 10 years and still not get to the bottom of it. So I think you'd be surprised what starts popping up, especially as the size and complexity of your documentation set grows and as the size of your writing team grows. Final thoughts are, if you've never written any scripts, if you've never done anything like this, it may look a little daunting, but the truth of the matter is, once you understand what you're doing, scripts are relatively inexpensive to create. Depending on what I'm doing, it might take me from between an hour or two to a couple of days to pull together a script, which then gets run repeatedly over and over again, saving labor and overhead in other parts of the company. And it's also true that the more scripts you write, the quicker they'll get written, because you'll start having a library of logic that you can rely on that helps you to push your scripting into other areas of your documentation team. In closing, headcount is very expensive and isn't always easy to find. Scripts can reduce those operating costs by reducing the number of people you actually have to hire, even as they accelerate your production processes. So I'm a big cheerleader for this effort, and I hope the people listening here will at least give it some serious thought. And I think that's it.
So we have one question. Have there been any issues with team members, especially writers, feeling overly scrutinized by the scoring system? And have we looked at NLTK, natural language processing, to inspect content as part of our scoring?
Okay, so I don't believe anybody's been feeling overly scrutinized. As I started developing this, I wanted to really make sure that the documentation managers understood that this shouldn't be used as like a blunt instrument to to keep writers in line. Of course, the first goal was to reduce our production processes and production problems at publishing time. But by constantly reinforcing the errors that we see popping up, what we're trying to do is instill good habits into the writing team. So, you can do that in a harsh way, or you can do that in a positive way. Since I'm usually the one reporting the errors, I try very, very hard to do that in a as positive of a fashion as I can. And it's never, and I try to talk to the individual writer. I don't go through their manager. It is also true that I am not a manager. I'm simply another writer. So hopefully that reduces any of those concerns. I haven't had any real complaints or received any complaints yet about writers who feel that this is oppressive. In terms of the natural language processing, no, I have not looked into that. We're just in the earliest stages of some of this stuff. So that'll be an interesting research project that'll be coming up pretty soon.
And a question about localizing content. We can both answer that. Yes, we do, but we do not check the content in the same way. Do you want to speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, we don't localize all of our content. We're very spotty about it, and it really comes down to the particular product and an individual document within the product that gets localized. We're not publishing any of that localized content in HTML, or I don't even know if it's available on AAM. I think all we're doing is producing PDF. We are using.
I think we will in the future, but right now it's just PDF.
Right. So we are using some of this logic that we built to help with the localization process. The people responsible for localization were having to manually build a book, say in Japanese, using DITA, and that was time consuming for them. So we created a script that makes it very easy for them to build and ensure that the book is building for localized content. But that's as far as we've taken it right now.
Yeah, and I think we also talked with that team about doing some sort of packaging automation project for them. So they have to figure out where all the associated images are across various directories, and they end up doing a large package of the entire image tree. So helping assist them to provide all the files needed for translation to streamline that process. So that's the upcoming project that we're thinking. So next question, is any of our code public? Would we or could we share it? At least one person would be interested in collaborating on a scoring system.
So it is not public. To be honest, I hadn't even considered this. There's some mechanical reasons why that might be hard to do, but it might be interesting to put some of this up on Git. So that's something I'm going to have to give some thought to, and actually I would have to approach our management team to see what the sort of legal hurdles would be for me to put that out there somewhere. I can't imagine it would be a big deal, but I think I'd have to do some research to find out if I could do that. But it would be nice to get some help on the scoring system.
Definitely. So next question, I'm not sure we'll have the best answer for this, but how about using extend script inside FrameMaker? It can control a lot of what is being inserted and with it build tools for editors.
I don't really know very much about it. I should be upfront and honest here and say I'm probably the only writer at Palo Alto Networks who does not use FrameMaker. But I would imagine that a script that's running inside of FrameMaker would be really useful to help a writer understand whether their content is up to snuff before they check it in. But unless there's a way to automate, make some kind of required way for that to run, like when you save the file or close FrameMaker or something, we would still be relying on the writers to remember to run it. And the test harness is really intended to catch, all those errors that pop up because writers get into a big hurry, they start cutting corners, they make mistakes. And usually the mistakes are small and easily corrected. But if you have, 5 people contributing to an admin guide, one person makes a mistake that makes it impossible to build the admin guide. Now, the other 4 people are not able to validate their content either. So regardless of what tools we might add to FrameMaker, I think you still end up having to have an external test harness.
Okay. I think this is a great question. How much of our time is spent running the system, and how much time do you actually spend authoring content?
Well, it comes and goes. So what we're doing is we're giving writers scripting work as they have time to do it. So every conversation I have with a writer when I ask them to do something is, what does your schedule look like? Do you have time for this? And if they don't have time for it, then it doesn't get done. But in my case, I would say that my time is pretty close to 50% on the tools and 50% on writing. I wish that I was spending more time writing and less time on the tools, but the test harness, because of the complexities of our environment, is causing me to spend a lot of time troubleshooting problems. So for like right now, I have a network issue. Somebody misconfigured a firewall, so I'm having to track that down. But in general, I would say the right mix would be for a writer who's contributing something to something like this. I'd say 10 to 25% of their time scripting, the rest of the time writing, with the scripting effort dropping to 0 as deadlines approach and other problems arise that they need to address.
Yeah, and there's probably an initial scripting effort that diminishes after you get the script off and running, then it's intended to alleviate the load each release. So.
Right. It does feed on itself. The more you write, the faster things get done, the less time you have to spend doing it.
Okay, one next question. Did you have to develop DITA specializations to publish API docs?
No, we started kind of going down that road. So far, what we've done with API docs is we've authored the API reference as reference topics in DITA, and just published using our standard enterprise publishing system. At the moment, for reasons that have actually nothing to do with DITA or AEM, we're beginning to look at an alternate publishing solution for our developer documentation. That's very early stages. But suffice to say that we already have a part of the company who is building a DevDoc presence. So we're going to try to jump in on that and contribute to it. So that won't even be a DITA solution.
Okay, well, I don't see any remaining questions. So thank you everyone for your time. If you have any follow-up questions, definitely get in touch with us. We'd love to connect.
And how can they get in touch with